超拔凌云，脱离绝业，人负天下，道观归尽，向邪归一，教民清真，穆罕默德这归圣人。
This was a poem written by one of the great emperors of China, praising the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and cherishing the religion of Islam that he brought to mankind. And to many of you, this may come as a surprise. What does Islam have to do with China? And how could it have had such an effect on the Chinese society that even an emperor would take the time to write and express his love and affection for the Prophet himself? But what you don't realize is that China used to be the center of Islam in Asia. With many Muslim rulers and a few independent Muslim sultanates, even the story of Aladdin was said to have taken place in the Muslim lands of China. From scholars to warriors to sailors and some of the greatest kung fu masters of their time, the Muslims of China have had a deep impact in Chinese history. And in this video, I'm going to show you the entire history of Islam in China. Our story begins in the mid-600s. Muslim merchants from Arabia and East Africa and Persia began sailing east across the oceans, building a trading network that reached as far away as China. During the reign of the third caliph, a delegation was sent in 650 to the then ruling emperor of China. Gifts were given, greetings were exchanged, and eventually the emperor ordered a masjid to be built in the port city of Guangzhou to support the growing community of Muslim traders there. But around the same time that this was happening, the Muslims had just finished the conquest of Persia, and they were now entering Central Asia from the west side. By now, the Chinese Empire had been expanding to the east, setting up garrisons in the region to protect their western flank. It was clear that the two empires were on a collision course with each other, competing for influence in the flat plains of Central Asia, but only one of them would come out victorious. Their fight began in the Fergana Valley in 715, when the Muslims deposed a local king and installed their own ruler in his place. In response, the Chinese sent an army of 10,000 men to take control of the valley and reinstall the king under their command. 2 years later, the Muslims then attacked again, this time attacking directly the Muslim garrisons, but the Chinese were well prepared and managed to defeat the Muslims at the Battle of Aksu. It was a major setback for the Muslim expansion in Central Asia, and the Chinese were able to force the Umayyads out of the Fergana Valley. But while the Muslim armies had been pushed out of the region for the time being, Muslim merchants continued to travel east along the Silk Road, making it as far as the capital of China. There, more Muslim communities were built inland, and in 742, one of China's most famous masjids was built. Eventually, the Muslim armies would return to the Fergana Valley in Central Asia, this time under the flag of the Abbasid Caliphate. And in 751, the Muslims managed to avenge themselves and defeat the Chinese at the Battle of Talas, marking the end of Chinese expansion to the west and bringing Islamic rule to the region. Soon after, the Chinese began to retreat back inward, but not because they had lost the battle. Rather, a new threat had emerged some 2,500 miles to the east, and this time, the Muslims would be on their side. You see, in 755, a rogue Chinese general proclaimed himself the new emperor of China, and the empire erupted into civil war. In response, the Chinese requested support from the Muslims, and the Abbasids sent 3,000 soldiers to help fight against the rebels. Eventually, the Tang Dynasty was able to regain control of the situation, and just when it looked like the rebellion was about to be defeated, one of the rebel generals decided to switch sides. In an attempt to gain the emperor's forgiveness for his rebellion, in 760, he went on to the city of Yangzhou, arrived in the Muslim quarters of the city, and massacred thousands of Arab and Persian merchants before making off with the loot he had stolen from them. He then brought this immense wealth as a gift to the emperor, who then forgave him. It was the first massacre of the Muslim population during the Tang Dynasty, but unfortunately it wouldn't be the last. In 874, another rebellion broke out, wreaking havoc throughout the country for a full decade. And during that time, the rebellion leader Huang Chao led his army to Guangzhou, where China's first masjid and Muslim community had originally been built. He then massacred tens of thousands of Muslims, as well as Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians and other foreigners living in the city. Twice now the Muslims had been slaughtered, but still they would keep coming back. The two rebellions had weakened the Tang dynasty immensely, and eventually in 907, the empire was split into competing kingdoms, and yet the flow of Muslim merchants never decreased. Soon after, the Song Dynasty emerged as the main power of China in 960, and under the new rulers, Muslims from Persia and Arabia found new opportunities, with many of them now beginning to work for the government. Throughout their reign, the Song Dynasty appointed Muslims as ministers of trade, keeping them as administrators who managed the wealthy Muslim merchants and the port cities in southern China. The Song Dynasty also brought the Muslims as soldiers, such as in 1070, when the emperor invited an emir from Bukhara and 5,300 of his men to help battle the Liao Empire in the northeast and repopulate areas ravaged by war. And after that, another 10,000 Muslim soldiers were invited to join him in China a decade later. Soon, Persian and Arab and even some Malay Muslims began intermarrying with the local Chinese, including the daughters of generals and bureaucrats, many of which converted to Islam as a result, and their children began a new generation of Chinese Muslims, which were known as the Hui people. These Muslim Hui Chinese were now becoming bureaucrats and generals and scholars and merchants, and eventually over time the term Hui began to mean any native Chinese person who had converted to Islam, whether they had Middle Eastern heritage or not. It was clear that Islam now had a foothold in Chinese society, and even though they were small in number, the Muslims, whether Arab or Persian or native Chinese, were now being put in positions of power, and Muslim influence was quickly spreading. But all that would soon change as a new threat began to emerge from the north, one that would destroy the great Muslim empires in the west and wreak havoc throughout the Muslim world. It was now the early 1200s. The Mongols had arrived. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and later his sons, the Mongol Empire quickly spread across Central Asia, massacring and destroying everything in its path. Within a few decades, they had destroyed the Muslim Khwarezmian Empire, and in 1258 they arrived at the gates of Baghdad and destroyed the city, killing up to 2 million people in the process and bringing an end to the Abbasid Caliphate. And while all this was happening in the West, the Mongols took a somewhat different approach to Muslims in China. In 1279, the Muslims had managed to conquer the Song Dynasty, renaming themselves the Great Yuan Dynasty and becoming the undisputed rulers of China. As part of their tactics of bringing minorities to rule over majorities, the Yuan Mongols then began importing administrators from Muslim regions that they had just conquered in order to work as governors in China. The most famous of these governors was Ejel Shamsuddin and his son Nasruddin, who ruled over Yunnan. Their influence became so great that even today there's a large Muslim population in the region, with many Hui Chinese people descending directly from them. A Persian vizier in another part of the Mongol Empire wrote that out of the 12 governorates in the Yuan Dynasty, 8 were ruled by Muslims, while the other 4 had Muslims as vice-governors. Soon the Mongols began importing Muslims from other fields to the Yuan Dynasty. Muslim scientists and astronomers, mathematicians, engineers, doctors, all were imported, bringing their knowledge from the Abbasid Caliphate, where the scientific golden age of Islam had once been. And to give you some perspective of their influence, even the capital city of Dadu was built in part by a Muslim architect named Amir ad-Din, a city which would later be renamed to Beijing in 1368. And this is when the Muslim scholarship in China began to flourish. A new writing system was created using Arabic letters to write the Chinese language, replacing Chinese characters. A new branch of Islamic scholarship was developed, attempting to explain Islamic concepts using Confucian terminology in an attempt to make it easy for Chinese people to understand Islam. The Muslims now had immense influence in the region, and under the Mongols, estimates show that the Muslim population grew to over 4 million people by the end of the 1300s. But the Mongols weren't exactly friends with the Muslims, and fearing that the Muslims were gaining too much influence, they enacted a number of policies to try and keep them in their place. They started banning Muslims from slaughtering their animals in a halal way, and they forbade Muslims and Jews from circumcision. Later on, Muslims were forced to follow Confucian law for governing their marriages, and they were banned from solving civil disputes with their own Islamic judges. These policies, among others, began to spark outrage in the Muslim community of China, and soon they began to join and support other non-Muslim groups in rebellions against the Mongols. In 1357, for example, an army led by 2 Persian Muslims revolted against the Yuan Dynasty, leading to almost a decade of war. In response, the Mongols massacred Muslims in Quanzhou, including almost the entirety of the Pu family, a Hui Chinese family which had ruled the city since the time of the Song Dynasty. However, the Mongols had now signed their death warrant, as 2 years after the rebellion was crushed, another dynasty would appear. A man who called himself the Hongwu Emperor rose to power with the support of a number of Hui Muslim generals, beginning the Ming Dynasty. This was the emperor who wrote the 100-character eulogy praising Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which I had began this video by reciting. Under the new rule of the Ming Dynasty, Arab and Persian Muslims would become fully integrated into Chinese society, building many masjids for them and having them intermarry with the Chinese. Muslims also then adopted Chinese surnames which most closely represented their original Arabic names. Ma or Han for Muhammad, Ha for Hassan, Hu for Hussein, Saif for Said, Shah for Shah, and so on. And perhaps the most important and well-known Muslim from this time period was a man named Ma He, originally from the province of Yunnan and the great-great-great-grandson of the governor Ajir Shamsuddin, which I had mentioned before. When Ma was still a young boy, the Ming Dynasty was still in the process of defeating the Mongols there. During their fighting in the late 1300s, the Ming Dynasty army captured and enslaved Ma He after killing his father. They then had him work as a servant in the household of the emperor's son, who would later go on to become an emperor himself. When that happened, Ma He was given special treatment, being given the name Zheng He as a title of honor and serving as the right hand to the emperor directly. Eventually, Zheng He was then given control of the Chinese navy and sent on a number of expeditions across the known world. Together with his fellow Muslim Chinese assistants, he traveled through Southeast Asia and India and Somalia before eventually making it to the Arabian Peninsula on his final journey, arriving in Mecca for Hajj. And throughout that time, leading fleets of hundreds of ships and up to 20,000 men, he began settling Chinese Muslim scholars in Indonesia and Malaysia and possibly even the Philippines, establishing small Muslim towns and communities which would go on to spread the message of Islam to the locals. And because of this, you will still find masjids all across the region named after him. Today, when people think of Islam in Asia, they think of Malaysia and Indonesia, but a lot of that spread originally came from China. Back in mainland China, the Ming Dynasty was on a decline, and in 644 a new dynasty would arise. The Qing Dynasty were originally from the Manchu people of Manchuria, a people with their own language and culture and history separate from the Han Chinese. But as Muslims had become loyal to the previous Ming Dynasty, a number of Muslim rebellions broke out defending China from the new invaders. For example, in the province of Gansu, the Muslim leaders Mi Layin and Ding Wudang led a revolution in 1646 against the Qing in what was called the Mi Layin Rebellion, and it was also supported by Prince Turumtai from the now Muslim Mongols of the Kumul Khanate in the west. But eventually the rebellion would be crushed, and Mi Layin and Ding Wudang and Turumtai as well would all be killed in battle. And before long, the Qing began a new conquest in the region, starting with the Kumul Khanate and taking all the lands in what's known as the province of Xinjiang in modern-day China. At the time, Xinjiang had been ruled by Turks and Mongols, split between the Buddhist Dzungars in the north and the Muslim Uyghurs in the south. In 1680, the Buddhist Dzungars had conquered the Muslim Uyghurs and were now ruling both north and south Xinjiang. And so when the Qing Dynasty appeared on their doorstep, war broke out, and it was mostly the Buddhist Dzungars who were fighting. Eventually, the Qing Dynasty managed to defeat the Buddhist Dzungars, and in 1755, the Qing Emperor ordered their genocide. More than 500,000 Buddhist Dzungars were killed either through disease or warfare, wiping their population off the face of the earth, leaving northern Xinjiang empty. The Qing Dynasty then began repopulating the area with some Han Chinese and Hui Muslim peoples, but most of the repopulation came from the Muslim Uyghurs, who now moved into the lands of the people that had once occupied them. And by the way, if you want to support the channel and help me pay my editors, you can sign up for my Patreon, link in the YouTube video description or on my TikTok profile. Anyway, Xinjiang was now a land inhabited by the Muslim Turkic Uyghurs, but it was still being ruled by the Qing Dynasty, and soon the situation became volatile. In 1765, Qing officials kidnapped Uyghur women and violated them for months on end. This led to a rebellion in Ukturpan, but the Qing armies were then sent against them, and thousands of Uyghur Muslims were massacred. In 1818, another Qing official kidnapped the Muslim daughter of one of the Uyghur chiefs of Kashgar, keeping her as a slave and violating her for over 2 years. This caused such shockwaves among the Muslims that in 1820 a group of warriors from Kokand in modern-day Uzbekistan attempted to take Kashgar from the Qing Empire. And while they were unsuccessful at first, a few years later, under the command of Jahangir Khoja, a new army of some 200,000 warriors launched a second attack. And in 1826 they managed to take control of Kashgar and a number of surrounding cities, briefly occupying the land. But hopes for the Uyghur Muslims wouldn't last, and in 1828 the Qing came at them with a huge army, massacring the civilians of Kashgar and capturing Jahangir Khoja himself. Jahangir Khoja was then sent to Beijing and paraded around the city in an iron cage for weeks, and after this process of humiliation was done, he was sentenced to be executed by Ling Qi, meaning slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts. But this didn't deter the rebellions, and 3 more unsuccessful invasions from Kokand would be launched in the following years. But rebellion in the West wasn't the only thing that the Qing Empire had to worry about. In 1850, a man claiming to be the brother of Jesus, peace be upon him, began a rebellion in the province of Guangxi in southern China. This rebellion was so violent and so deadly that in the 14 years that it lasted, as many as 30 million people were killed in the violence. And this wasn't the only rebellion taking place at the time. Other rebels took inspiration and started their own rebellions all over the country. The entire region was on fire and anarchy was everywhere, and in some cases the Hui Muslims became the target of violence. Back in the province of Yunnan, one of the major hubs of Islam in China, bandit gangs called Incense Brotherhoods began stealing from and harassing the Hui Muslims. This went on for years, eventually coming to a boiling point when in 1845, in the city of Baoshan, bandits vandalized a local masjid. In response, the Muslims of that village formed their own gang and began attacking the bandits in retaliation. Deciding to put an end to the feud with the support of the Qing government, the bandits then entered the city one night and massacred some 8,000 Hui Muslims. But still, many Muslims survived in the city, one of which was a man by the name of Du Wenxiu, who decided that the only way for the Muslims to protect themselves would be if they all banded together and created their own sultanate. He began calling on the Hui Muslims of Yunnan to unite against the Qing government, seeing them as ultimately responsible for the attacks against the Muslims. In response, in 1856, the ruler of Kunming, which was the capital of Yunnan at the time, formed a militia and began to eradicate Hui Muslims in and around the city. Another 8,000 Muslims were killed in the Kunming massacre, and soon local uprisings by Hui Muslims began to spread across the entire province. Du Wenxiu managed to then unite these small rebellions under his command, and they attacked and captured the city of Dali, forming their own government and their own army, and calling the new state the Yunnan Sultanate. For the next 16 years, they fought against the Qing government, expanding their sultanate across the western half of Yunnan, and even briefly capturing the city of Kunming in the east. But betrayal and infighting led to cracks in the rebellion, and the Qing Dynasty was able to take advantage of the situation and launch an attack against the Yunnan Sultanate. And by 1872, Qing troops had managed to capture the city of Dali, sacking it and massacring the entire Hui population of men, women, and children. 10,000 people were killed, and Du Wenxiu himself was captured and beheaded. But while all this was happening in the south, another sultanate was still surviving in the west. Back in Xinjiang in 1862, a new rebellion had taken place in Kashgar, led by the Kokandi ruler Yaqub Bey. Taking advantage of the chaos across China, Yaqub formed the Kashgar Emirate with the support of the Ottoman Empire, even flying the Ottoman flag as their official symbol. But in this case, Yaqub was known as somewhat of a tyrant, not much better than the Qing rulers before him. And taking advantage of this, the Qing decided to send an army of Han Chinese and Hui Muslims to take back Kashgar. Using a policy of forgiveness, they pardoned the rebels who had surrendered if they had joined Yaqub Bey's forces only for religious reasons. Rebels received rewards for defecting and assisting the Qing, hoping to win the Muslims over with benevolence in contrast to Yaqub's oppressive rule. This tactic worked, and in 1877 Kashgar was retaken and once again brought under Qing control. As for what happened to Yaqub Bey, no one knows for sure, but reports suggest that he may have been poisoned or killed in battle, or even died of a stroke. Either way, the last of the Xinjiang rebellions against the Qing dynasty had been snuffed out. But this time, it was because the Qing themselves were on their way out. Having barely survived all the rebellions of the last century, and having been invaded by the British, French, Japanese, and Americans, the Qing dynasty had now become weak, and China had now become a playground for foreign powers to steal and loot from the country everything that they could. In response, a number of secret societies emerged, teaching and training in both martial arts and firearms with the intention of growing in strength to eventually defeat the foreign powers and kick them out of China. And there were a lot of Hui Muslims that joined these groups. The most famous of these secret societies was called the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. And in 1899, they launched into a rebellion that was later known as the Boxer Uprising. Together, and even initially supported by the Qing dynasty, the rebels attacked the foreign invaders in a series of battles. The Qing dynasty even managed to assemble a unit of 10,000 Muslim troops known as the Kansu Braves to help in the fight. However, foreign invaders formed an alliance, and the Qing dynasty was forced to make a deal with them, withdrawing from the war. The eight-nation alliance then descended upon the Chinese rebels, fighting several battles with them before eventually crushing the rebellion in 1901. The rebels were then hunted down and killed wherever they could be found. But perhaps one of the most famous stories of those rebels was that of Wang Ziping, a Hui Muslim kung fu fighter who was forced to flee to the city of Jinan, where he found a masjid and took refuge inside. During his time in hiding in the masjid, Wang Ziping met a Muslim Grand Master there by the name of Yang Hongzhou, who agreed to take him under his wing. For the next few years, he trained under him, learning various techniques and different weapons, and eventually he began to create his own unique style of kung fu, and legends and half-true stories began to surround him. One story describes how German soldiers wanted to steal the doors of the Qingzhou Masjid. The doors were particularly beautiful, having been carved by a master craftsman some 500 years earlier. In response, Wang Ziping led the Muslims to camp outside the masjid in order to guard the doors from the German soldiers. The Germans, wanting to humiliate Wang Ziping, made a proposal. They brought him two giant 250-pound stones connected together by a large bamboo bar, and they said that if he could lift this weight, they would leave the doors alone. So Wang Ziping accepted the challenge, doing a backflip and landing on his back in front of the stones, then grabbing the bamboo bar and doing a bench press with it. And if that wasn't enough, the story says he even threw the stones up in the air and caught the bar with his feet and started doing leg presses with the weight. Needless to say, the Germans didn't get the doors. And while stories like this are certainly an exaggeration, Wang Ziping eventually did become a well-renowned Grand Master in a number of martial arts, and it was only in 1973 that he finally passed away. Back in the early 1900s, the Qing Dynasty was in its death throes, and in 1911, a final series of uprisings took place, which finally toppled the government after so many years. The leader of this new rebellion was a man by the name of Sun Yat-sen, who then declared the founding of the Republic of China, one nation that belonged equally to the 5 races represented by the 5-color flag. Red for Han Chinese, yellow for the Manchus, which the Qing Dynasty came from, blue for the Mongols, black for the Tibetans, and white for the Muslims. And while Sun Yat-sen was indeed the founder, he only served as the provisional president for a few months, until another military general by the name of Yuan Shikai managed to negotiate his way into power, becoming the president of the republic before later declaring himself the Emperor of China in 1915. But this transition back to an empire infuriated provincial rulers all around the country, and they began to revolt and declare independence for themselves. Caving under the pressure, Yuan Shikai abdicated the throne and restored the republic after only 83 days. But by then, the damage had already been done, and his prestige was in ruins. He died in office only a few months later, but by then the republic was fragmented, being ruled by a number of warlord cliques, each with their own separate alliances. Among these were the Kuomintang led by Sun Yat-sen in the south, the Beiying government in Beijing, which had been loyal to Yuan Shikai, the Xinjiang clique, which were a mix of Han Chinese and Hui Muslim generals that ruled over the Uyghur majority in Xinjiang, and of course the Ma clique, an alliance of Hui Muslim generals that ruled over the provinces of Qinghai, Gansu, and Ningxia. Similar to the concept of the Bible Belt in the US, these three provinces plus Xinjiang have historically been greatly influenced by Muslims, making them what's known as the Quran Belt in China. But while this fragile balance of power had been held between the various warlord cliques, a completely new movement would begin to rise in China, one that was following in the footsteps of another revolution taking place around the same time, deep in the heartland of Russia. There, under Vladimir Lenin, the Bolshevik Revolution was well underway, and back here in the Republic of China in 1921, soon to be led by a young Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party was founded. Initially, the Communist Party and the newly created Soviet Union supported Sun Yat-sen and the Kuomintang in retaking the entire country. But when Sun Yat-sen suddenly died in 1925 and his successor Chiang Kai-shek took control of the party, a rift formed between the Kuomintang and the communists, and eventually Chiang Kai-shek led a massacre against them, killing thousands of communists in Shanghai. Chiang Kai-shek then led a military campaign against the Beiyang government, defeating them and capturing both Nanjing and Beijing from them in 1928. And with those two cities under his control, he managed to temporarily unify China under the Kuomintang, with the other cliques agreeing to submit to him, at least on paper. And this is when rebellion once again began knocking on the doors of Xinjiang. During this time, Xinjiang had been ruled by a Han Chinese general who had actually studied Islam and had strong connections with leading Muslim families in Yunnan, and so much of his army was made up of Hui Muslims. But in 1928, he was assassinated and a much more oppressive ruler took control. In 1930, this new ruler then annexed the Kumul Khanate, repeating the mistakes of the Qing Dynasty before him and sparking a new war in the region. The Kumul Khans then sent a representative to the Ma clique, their fellow Muslims, seeking help against that ruler and the Xinjiang clique. The Ma clique then responded by sending the Muslim general Ma Zhongying with an army to attack them. And because the Ma clique was supported by the Kuomintang, the Xinjiang clique then joined sides with their enemy, the Soviet Union. But things were about to become a lot more complicated. In 1933, under the leadership of Muhammad Amin Bughra, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang decided to take advantage of the chaos and declared their independence in the first East Turkestan Republic. And so now you had this crazy three-way war going on in Xinjiang. The Uyghurs of the first East Turkestan Republic, the Xinjiang clique, which was supported by the Soviets, and the Kumul Khanate, which was supported by the Ma clique and the Kuomintang. But the Xinjiang wars went on for years, ending in a stalemate with no side really able to defeat the other. Even when the first East Turkestan Republic was destroyed, a second one took its place only a few years later. But there was one event that would soon shake the entire foundation of China to its core and cause even the worst of enemies to join together in a fight for their survival. It was now 1937, and Japan had now invaded China. It was one of the most devastating wars in history, and one that would become part of the battlefield that was World War II. From 1937 to 1945, war raged on in China, and up to 22 million people would be killed in the fight. And Hui Muslims in particular were targeted. The Japanese began a policy of destroying masjids and killing countless Hui Muslims indiscriminately. Hundreds of masjids were destroyed and others were found filled with dead bodies inside. In other incidents, Japanese soldiers took Muslim women and violated them, and Muslims were deliberately humiliated in other ways, such as being forced to eat pig meat and having their graveyards destroyed. There was no time for China to be fragmented. They needed to unite. And so both the communists and the Kuomintang formed a united front. Numerous Muslim generals joined in the fight, and Muslims all across the country united against the Japanese. Together, the Chinese managed to defend its borders from the Japanese, and with the US dropping 2 atomic bombs in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan formally surrendered in 1945, ending the war. But with the external threat now gone and the country in complete shambles, tensions rose once again between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, and in 1945, a new civil war would erupt. Soon, Chinese soldiers were forced to pick sides. Most of the Hui Chinese generals remained loyal to the Kuomintang, but some defected to the communist side, believing that there was a better alternative. By 1949, the communists managed to decisively win the civil war, taking control of mainland China, and the Muslims who were loyal to the Kuomintang were forced to flee to the island of Taiwan, where the successor of the Kuomintang still remained in power till this day. In one story, there had been 2 generals that had been close friends before the civil war. But when the communists took over in China, Ma Chengxiang fled to Taiwan, while Han Yuan defected to the communists. But some 38 years after splitting up, Han Yuan decided to write a letter to Ma Chengxiang, reminiscing about the good old days, and it was reported that they met one last time in Hong Kong soon after. But while the Kuomintang and its Muslim generals had been forced to flee, they didn't immediately give up, but rather they began an insurgency fighting in guerrilla warfare. Around 14,000 soldiers, almost entirely Muslim, began to revolt throughout the Muslim strongholds in Yunnan and the Quran Belt. Chiang Kai-shek continued to support them with planes that dropped supplies and arms to them. Soon, the insurgency even began expanding to Burma, while the Muslims from neighboring Yunnan could then use the thick jungle to hide their operations. But even with all their efforts, the communist forces now had a stronghold on mainland China, and by 1958, the insurgency had been put down, with many of its leaders being killed in action or executed. The rest, however, fled to Taiwan. And because of their loyalty and perseverance to the cause, when everyone else had given up, the Muslims of China are still revered and well respected in Taiwan to this day. But back in mainland China, life for the Muslims wasn't as easy. During the Cultural Revolution, Islam, along with other religions in the country, were persecuted, and the atheist, student-led paramilitary group known as the Red Guards attacked and vandalized traditional Chinese, Confucian, and Buddhist temples, Christian churches and monasteries, and of course, Muslim masjids, all with the goal of getting rid of what were known as the 4 olds: old customs, old cultures, old habits, and old ideas. In response, the Hui Muslims led the only large-scale ethnic rebellion during the Cultural Revolution, taking place in 1975 in several villages in Yunnan. But this rebellion was quickly suppressed, and many Muslims were killed or had their homes destroyed. But after the Cultural Revolution was over, the Communist Party began to curb many of their extreme policies and blamed most of the violent parts of the Cultural Revolution on a few bad apples. Those people were either given life imprisonment or executed, and the Communist Party gave an official apology to the Hui Muslims, offering reparations for the damages suffered. And that leaves us with the Muslims of China today. It seems that the treatment of Muslims in China isn't the same across the country, but rather it varies from place to place. And while the Uyghurs in Xinjiang may be living in a particularly difficult situation in a land known for constant rebellion, there are many places in China where the Hui Muslims are actually the majority population, and they live very normal lives. In these places, they are virtually indistinguishable from Han Chinese, only different in some of the clothing they wear or the food that they eat. Undoubtedly, the history of Muslims in China is long and complicated, with times of glory and stability and other times of desperate survival as a minority. But now, with anywhere from 18 to 25 million Muslims living in China today, perhaps the Muslims of China still have a long and bright future ahead of them. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you really like the video, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. It really helps me pay my editors who do fantastic work on videos like these. And of course, subscribe for more long-form documentaries on the Muslim world.